This is Musical Talk,
Musical Talk.
the UK's independent musical theatre podcast.
Musical Talk, the UK independent musical theatre podcast.
Well, hello everyone and welcome to Musical Talk. A couple of new voices on for you today. I'm Jen Green.
And I'm Anna Shields.
Yes, Nick and Thos have let us have their microphones for half an hour or so. And we're going to be doing something slightly different this episode. We thought that we would have a look at that age-old question of what is an opera, what's a musical? So we all know what we think's an opera and what's a musical. I'm Anna. I know that an opera is a fairly large-scale theatrical work, and it has music and acting and sometimes dancing and some really spectacular sets, except when you get operas on a really small scale, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, and a musical. Well, that's a large theatrical work, and that has music, acting, and sometimes dancing, and usually some really spectacular sets.
Except when it's done on a small scale.
Yeah. But I still know the difference between them. So Tosca is an opera, and Phantom of the Opera, despite its title, is a musical, right?
Supposedly so, yes.
Well, this week Anna and I are going to spend some time unpicking the opera-musical divide. We're just going to spend a bit of time talking about the perceived and real differences and the areas of crossover. I'm pretty sure that we won't be able to definitively categorise opera or musical theatre by the end of the show, but that's not really the point and wouldn't be much use to anybody anyway, would it, Anna?
Not really, no. I'm kind of reminded of the opening quote to my undergraduate dissertation. This is going to sound terribly academic now, and I can't remember who said it, but the line says, "Musical theatre is as old as history itself." And really, that makes me think that there is no such difference, as you've just outlined. Big sets, there are musical numbers, there are dance numbers, there's singing, there's acting, there's everything. So is there really a difference between the two?
I think that I do. I think I know when I see an opera, and I think that I know when I see a musical. But then I start thinking about what the differences are, and I get in a bit of a pickle. So let's continue getting in a pickle.
Absolutely, let's get in a pickle, Jen.
Okay, let's start off with the easy ones. Anna, what is the quintessential musical for you? What is definitely a musical and not an opera?
For me, Mamma Mia is definitely, well, is it a musical? That's a whole other kettle of fish. But
we're not going to go there this week.
We won't go down the jukebox road. But Mamma Mia, to me, is a musical. Shrek is a musical. West Side Story begins to blur the distinction between the two a little bit.
And what's definitely an opera?
Madame Butterfly is an opera. Tosca, as you've already mentioned, is an opera. But what makes us define those productions as being an opera is really a question of delivery, I think.
I would like to pick up on your point about West Side Story. So you say that that's starting for you to cross over into the opera divide. Now, my question is that just because it's a bit older than the others?
It could well be, and it's interesting because West Side Story kind of ended an era of the big sort of story-driven musicals that were started with Rodgers and Hammerstein, things like that, you know, and ended with shows like My Fair Lady in the mid-50s. And West Side Story kind of launched this revolutionary way of telling stories and telling stories through dance, whereas things before, you know, had told stories through music and through lyrics. But I think it is the orchestrations and the musical style that makes it feel more operatic, and indeed that one of the most famous recordings was performed by opera singers as opposed to by musical singers, to use those two terms quite loosely.
Although interestingly, I was looking at the score for West Side Story quite recently, and it's actually got quite a large musical theatre orchestration for what we would maybe use today. You've got, from memory, I think it's 5 reeds that's double across it. You wouldn't get that in an operatic orchestra. I can't quite imagine asking your flute player to play clarinet as well at the Royal Opera House. I'm sure they can very well, but I don't think it would be done. A small string section and rhythm section. But that's my question. Is it that we just start seeing older musicals as more operatic? Was La Bohème basically the phantom of its day? Would people have viewed it in the same way, and have we just put it on an operatic pedestal because it's 100 years old now?
It's an interesting point, because I think a lot of people start getting into a class divide and this sort of highbrow, lowbrow debate when it comes to opera versus musical. And really, it's a question of how they're culturally perceived and marketed and funded, and venue, I think, has massive influence on the debate, because you go and see something at the Colosseum or at the Royal Opera House, and there is this feeling of grandeur that you get by entering one of those two buildings, and that makes you just think, wow, this is a special experience, this is something a bit more. Whereas if you go to a slightly run down, really useful group-owned theatre in the West End, sometimes you don't feel like things are happening on such a grand scale, and there's almost a slight sort of dumbing down of the production, it feels.
So you're saying it's almost the expectations of the audience walking in that basically transform the piece into what it is. So if I go and see Candide at an opera house, I'll think it's an opera. But if I go and see it at a theatre that plays musicals or straight theatre, I will think it's a musical.
I think there's a lot of truth in that, yes. And I think also the other thing that has a massive effect on this is the length of a run. You know, opera singers can't sustain 8 shows a week, so a lot of opera companies are working rep, and these shows, or productions as I know they're more favourably called in the opera world, run for 10 performances a season. So there's a sort of slightly fresh nature in how they're performed, and a sense of occasion in a sense that, we can only catch Madame Butterfly, in there's only 10 opportunities to see it at the ENO this year, whereas there are hundreds of opportunities to see Singing in the Rain at the Palace. Hopefully
you can go next week. Yes.
You can go next week. So I think that's another big influence on the divide between the two, of this sort of special nature of the opera, and this making it slightly more grand. And
you think it's got a bit of a champagne flutes and smoked salmon sandwiches aura about it?
I think it does, yes. And I think that because of that, it is a discouraging genre for young people who want to get into seeing live performance, because it's expensive and people tend to dress up to go to the opera. It's all on a very large and very grand scale, and I think that can be off-putting for some people. I remember going to see a musical when I was in the 6th form. We had to see it to write an essay about it. And we were seeing it on tour at the Theatre Royal in Plymouth, and one boy who I did A-level drama with had never been to a big theatre, and he rocked up at school to get the coach to Plymouth wearing a suit, and we all laughed at him. And he said, "Isn't this what you wear to the theatre?" And someone said, "Well, maybe to the opera, but not to see Blood Brothers on tour." It was kind of remarkable that a guy at the age of 18 who was studying theatre at school and loved it had this perception that this is what he should be wearing, and that this is what he should do and how he should behave.
Musical talk.
Anna, Sweeney Todd. Now, I've recently seen the London production of that, which in my mind was definitely a musical, but it's also been produced in opera houses all over the world. Now, Sondheim had an interesting thought on that, didn't he?
He did. He said that something is an opera if it's performed in an opera house. So a production of Sweeney Todd performed in an opera house makes it an opera, but performed in any other venue makes it a musical. There become problems with that as well, because if you think about the Opera Up Close production of La Bohème at the Cock Tavern and King's Head, that's a pub theatre, that's not an opera house. Yet it's
Yes, I think
La
I
Bohème.
definitely saw an opera
yeah.
in a pub, though, there.
And ENO's collaboration with Punch Drunk last year, which was the Duchess of Malfi, sort of new operatic and experimental operatic piece, performed in a disused warehouse in the East London sticks. One would think it operatic given the vocal technique and delivery of the piece, but it was really an immersive Punch Drunk piece, as they are known
And that's not what we expect from opera.
Not what we expect. So is that
I
opera,
like all this
or-
cross-boundary
I know,
stuff.
isn't it good?
Yeah,
Doesn't it just wind you up?
Now, you said something really interesting about vocal technique, and
Mm.
I feel that we might be getting to a nub of something here. So let's talk about that. You had a great story about your cousin, I remember you telling me.
I do have a great story about my cousin, which is that my cousin is an opera singer, and I am, to all intents and purposes, a musical theatre singer. Although I was classically trained as a kid for the last 10 years, I've worked very much on the musical voice. But she and I were recently asked to perform the Flower Duet from Lakme. I thought, I'm doing a pretty good job of this, whacking out my old classical soprano voice. And we came to have a rehearsal, and she just completely dwarfed me. And it showed the real difference is that vocal power, because the opera voice remains an acoustic voice. Opera singers still sing acoustically and are trained to sing above a full orchestra, whereas musical theatre singers are not. And that's not to do a disservice to the musical theatre performers, because the storytelling in a musical and the way the story is told through song requires character and different vocal techniques. You wouldn't want to hear someone singing Adelaide's Lament from Guys and Dolls in an operatic voice. So different things are required. Opera singers don't know how to belt, but musical theatre singers don't have elongated vowels and don't have to sing cadenzas unless they're in Phantom of the Opera. They don't have to sing above an orchestra, they are mic'd. And all of these things go some way to helping us classify whether something is an opera or a musical. And the crossover of artists is interesting, because opera singers can cross over into musical theatre. If you think of Alfie Boe being in Les Mis, or Kristen Chenoweth, who joined as an opera singer and has made her name in musical theatre and comedy. Leslie Garrett being Mother Superior in Sound of Music. It's an easier crossover to make from opera into musical theatre, but you wouldn't get a soap star or a retired pop star going and being in a production of La Bohème. You might get them playing Billy Flynn in Chicago.
So there are two areas of vocal technique really that we've got here that are different. There's the actual sound volume that comes out, and there's also the question of how the words are put across, because opera is very much about the music,
yes,
rather than the words. So really it shouldn't matter whether you're hearing an opera in French or German, it's the music that's coming across.
I think, yes, that's true. It's a musically driven narrative, whereas musical theatre is about the words. I remember doing a production of Assassins when I was 18, and I was cast as the balladeer, and it's an all-singing role. And I went to visit my grandmother, who was the director, and I said, "Granny, it's all gone wrong. How on earth am I supposed to, be assessed on my acting when I've got an all-singing role?" And she said, "Darling, what makes you think you're not acting through song?" And it kind of made me reappraise how I approached singing in musical theatre, because it is all about the words. It's all about the delivery of those words and that acting. And people often say that opera singers can't act, but perhaps there isn't such a need for them to, when the music can drive the narrative along. As you say, you could see an opera in French and still gauge what's happening.
Although it's that, though, that we know what's happening. Even that starts to break down a lot, because, for example, a lot of Mozart is much funnier when you know the words and when you can hear the words. If someone's singing a song about Don Giovanni's mistresses, it helps if you know that he's saying he had 100 in Spain,
yes,
and all over the country and this many in France.
Because it's part of the sort of canon of works that we're all familiar with. You're right that there's a lot of opera that we've just come to know and understand. In the same way that we know and understand ballet, although there are clear actions that dancers make to distinguish between love and hate and all that sort of thing, we still know the story of Romeo and Juliet or of the Nutcracker. So we're swept along with the way the music tells the story and how the dancers obviously portray that story.
So for me, all that brings up a couple of questions. Firstly, what happened in a world pre-mics? Is this why we start thinking of earlier musicals from the 20th century in more operatic terms. Is this why, say, Opera North are doing a production of Carousel? Because those productions would have been performed by singers who did have to reach the back of a hall and use that slightly different vocal technique. Does that make a difference, Anna?
I think it does make a difference, and I think that's why the crossover from sort of opera into operetta and then early musical theatre is a little bit blurry, really. I mean, everyone claims that Showboat was the first musical, but you hear a song like Old Man River and it sounds like it's Willard White doing a massive opera piece. And I think, that's because writers at that time were used to operatic styles and both in terms of writing music and in terms of vocal delivery. It was really rock music that ruined everything. Or
ruined
did it?
Everything,
Ruin's
Anna.
a strong word.
That's an interesting word.
I've dug
to
myself
use.
an early grave. Ruined is the wrong word. Rock music actually change. Thank you, Jen. That's a much wiser word to use. We wouldn't have Rent if we hadn't had the Beatles, but we also wouldn't have Rent if we hadn't had La Boheme.
Brings us on to another interesting area, which is musicals based on operas. For me, there's a question on whether Rent is just an updating of La Boheme for a different generation.
I think it is. What's clever about Rent is that Jonathan Larson didn't try to borrow from Puccini, except in its story, and that it, La Boheme was the rock of its day. Puccini was the Larson of his day.
Indeed, he was. Large penchant for fast cars. Incredibly popular. I mean, if we're talking about looking at superstar composers, Puccini was out there.
That kind of makes me think back to this whole highbrow, lowbrow debate, and why I think that's a dead end when it comes to these kinds of discussions, because you might think Puccini is this god now, but at the time he may have been as controversial a composer as someone saying let's do a Spice Girls musical is today. It was popular culture of its time, but it's found this place in the hearts of everyone as a sort of treasured and high form and this wonderful opera.
Well, history does have a habit of making everything clearer
the
further we get away from it.
And it would be interesting to see how the last 40 or 50 years of musical theatre are preserved in history, because whether we'll be seen as this golden age of musical theatre or as a bunch of people who didn't really know what they were doing, just trying to make a fast buck.
Well, I think Andrew Lloyd Webber's interesting in that terms. Can you imagine Andrew Lloyd Webber playing in opera houses in 40, 50 years? I think I can. Yeah,
I think I can, and certainly bigger, more sort of luscious scores of his, like Phantom and Sunset and things like that.
Well, Phantom's interesting because a lot of it parodies opera as well, so actually you need someone who can put across a convincing opera voice for Carlotta.
Yeah, I can see Andrew Lloyd Webber playing in 50 years' time.
It's we are the arbiters of this kind of thing, aren't we? What are we doing, Anna?
I can see Sondheim playing in 50 years' time. I hope that Stiles and Drew will be playing in 50 years' time. I don't know whether
in an opera house or
Mamma
a musical theatre, though.
Good question. I think a lot of it comes back to story and character, and it's the shows or works that have a story that everyone loves and believes in, that last and that make history, and
in a way keep being reinvented for each generation.
Yes.
I think that Carmen's very interesting in that you've got Bizet's original, which actually when it first came out wasn't particularly popular, but has now built itself up into one of the great works in the operatic canon today.
Yes.
You then get a production of Carmen Jones, which actually takes the same music, so it uses Bizet's original score, reorchestrates it and updates the story to a different time, and that suddenly becomes a musical.
Yes, it's like the Mikado and the Hot Mikado.
The Hot Mikado, tell me about that. I haven't heard that one.
The jazzed up version of the Mikado.
We should talk about Porgy and Bess as well, because that's another interesting one, written by the Gershwins as a musical, but actually very operatic.
Yes, and the Gershwins, of course, famous for Timpan Alley jazz standards, and yet made a place in history as this odd crossover, with this odd crossover production in Porgy and Bess.
Which is, I think, playing at the ENO this summer with the Cape Town Opera.
And is on Broadway at the moment.
So that's interesting. It's currently up there as in both musical and operatic form.
Going back to the talk of stars and crossover stars, Audra McDonald is in the Broadway production. She just won the Tony Award this week. And she is an opera singer who has made a very successful career crossing over into musical theatre. With a show like Porgy, I think that's where you've got a hit on your hands, because if you've got a star like Audra who can appeal to the opera fans and to the musical theatre fans, then you've got an even bigger reach to an audience. Sondheim always says he wishes he'd written Porgy and Bess. I'm quite glad
I think
the
a lot
Gershwins
of
did.
people wish they'd written Porgy and Bess. Actually, one thing that I think's interesting in new writing at the moment is that I think in both the opera and musical worlds, the distinctions in style are increasing. So in musical theatre, I feel that composers at the moment are either going very much down a popular music route, and I mean popular music of today, or a more classically influenced route. So I'm thinking, especially things like Adam Gettel with Floyd Collins, it's bluegrass influenced, but it feels like it's come out of a classical composer.
It's interesting because I think in the olden days there was more crossover for composers, probably because there were fewer of them. If you think of someone like Bernstein, who had a wonderful career as a composer, as an orchestrator, as a conductor, you don't necessarily get people like that these days who do a bit of everything and who have success in music theatre, in opera, in classical music, in lots of different genres. People tend to pick their style and work with it. That's what's quite interesting about new opera being written today. You've got people like Philip Glass, Nico Muhly, Damon Albarn's Dr. D.
Well, I think that's an interesting one as well, because while I think that there is a pressure on composers to specialise more, actually success in one area will inevitably lead to invites for another one, so you end up with Stephen Schwartz following Wicked with an opera.
Absolutely. And had Damon Albarn not had Blur, would he have had Dr. D? It's interesting to see how success maketh the man. And
Adam Gettel as well has written both musicals and opera. Whether there's any more distinction to them than where they're played, I don't know. I've actually, interestingly, I was listening recently to Bernstein's A Quiet Place, which, if we're talking about word-driven music, I could hear all the words, I could understand them. It would definitely have been poorer without them. I'm not sure that was exactly it. Why is that classified as an opera, and why is On the Town, for example, classified as a musical normally? They're both incredibly complex musically in different ways. They both have great memorable tunes as well. It can't just be that.
I think that's a really interesting point, because this whole debate that music drives an opera and words drive a musical gets a bit fuzzy when you think about songs like Sit Down, You're Rocking the Boat. Now, Jen, you and I have both worked on this song with a group of singers before, and the famous Great Big Wave Came and Washed Me Overboard line, the way it's underscored vocally and by the orchestra, tells that story of that wave. For me, it's one of those moments that just makes me go, this is genius. Yeah, Guys and Dolls is a musical, but people can't ever say that the music doesn't tell the story in musical theatre, but it does in opera.
And opera, I would argue that I personally very much like listening to operas in English, because I can understand the words and I know what's happening. I think that perhaps there's an argument to be made that opera, people know the story and words already. It's a bit like Shakespeare. You know, people usually know the plot, whereas musicals you don't. Therefore, you can just go along and you can listen to the music, but you know what's happening anyway.
It's a very good point, because people often say they're going to hear an opera, but they're going to see a musical.
Well, and of course then you've got the supremacy, shall we say, of the director versus musical director or conductor. In opera, it's usually accepted that the conductor is the top of the tree, shall we say. Although, interestingly, again, there are companies getting in star directors to direct operas, which is starting to blur that boundary as well. Whereas in a musical theatre, it's the director who will be making all the calls there.
It's interesting you should say about the conductor being the top of the opera tree. I watched the most recent Maestro series on the BBC, which Craig Revel Horwood won. And when he was conducting, the winner of the series got to conduct one act of...
Sounds
can't
terrifying.
remember what production it was. But the winner of the series got to conduct one act of an opera at the Royal Opera House. And Craig was getting very nervous, understandably, when he came in for a tech run. And he was speaking to the chap who conducted the first act. And he said, "What do you do normally, Craig?" And he said, "I'm a choreographer." And he said, and a director, and he said, "What do choreographers and directors do?" He said, "They tell stories on stage and use their bodies." And he said, "What does a conductor do?" He says, "They help people tell stories on stage and use their bodies." And so you kind of think, well, who is the top of the tree in any genre, really? Because at the end of the day, we're just telling stories.
Opera is subsidised and does have a great range of seats at different prices. So actually, if you want to go and see a piece of theatre, you can often go and see an opera more cheaply than you can go and see a piece of musical theatre. And I think there's a really interesting area around the subsidising thing, which links into what you're saying about running times as well.
Yes, you know, it's no secret that the opera is subsidised very heavily.
A musical theatre tends not to be, except at a very grassroots level.
Yeah. Opera is also heavily subsidised by its fans and its audiences, which goes back to this whole slightly high art perception of the opera. You know, you go into the Colosseum and you see its list of benefactors written on the wall, and it's...
And maybe that leads to being able to take more risks there as well. A musical theatre production of Sweeney Todd has to recoup its money, or the producers make a big loss and can't do anything the next time. An operatic production of Sweeney Todd will run for, say, 10, 20 performances, and it's not the be-all and end-all of a career if it doesn't recoup its investment.
It's interesting to see about how operas are developed. Obviously there are a lot of revivals in opera, particularly at ENO, perhaps one or two new or newer works every year. But I think there are fewer people out there writing new opera, so the chances of getting it workshopped and developed are perhaps more likely.
Yeah. Although ENO do have a great competition on Open at the moment.
Yes, ENO do have mini operas, which is a new scheme. They've filtered down a series of book writers who have written very short books inspired by 3 stories that were given to them as a stimulus, and now the composition round has opened and composers can write music to accompany those stories, and then the filmmaking round opens and filmmakers can put those stories and the music on film. And I think it's a great idea, but something that only occurred to me recently because I'm considering entering the competition is, who do I get to sing on my demos? It makes me think, you know, is there a difference between an opera composer and a musical theatre composer?
There we go. Is it tradition? Does it matter? Probably not. Enjoy whatever you're seeing this summer, whether it's an opera or a musical, or you can't quite decide, or you just don't want to classify it at all. It's probably more fun that way anyway.
At least you're in a theatre. Or an opera house. Or whatever building anyone wants to call it. This has been a production of Musical Talk, copyright 2012. It was presented by Anna Shields and Jen Green and edited by Nick Hudson.
And here are some musical out-talks.
Duty's been decreed.
Okay.
Are we the most annoying people you've ever had on this
This has
show?
got to be a new low for him, hasn't it? you
For some reason I feel like singing YMCA.
I do feel like singing. It's weird.
Young man.
There's no need to feel down. Do we want to call it that? Do we want a slightly